Thank you very much, Lady Chair. Your Worship, the Mayor of Arima, Chairman of the Tunapuna Piako Corporation, Minister of Education, Mr. Anthony Garcia, who is also identified as the Member of Parliament for all Arima, Minister of Housing and Urban Development, Mr. Randall Mitchell, Member of Parliament for San Fernando East, the Minister of Planning and Development, Mrs. Camille Robinson-Regis, Member of Parliament for Ruka Maloney, Minister of Public Administration and Communications, Mr. Maxie Cuffie, Member of Parliament for La Capital Paro, Minister of Public Utilities, Brigadier General Ansel Antoine, our visiting Mayor of San Fernando, members of the corporations of Arima, of Tunapuna Piako and the Borough of Arima, Chairman of the HDC, Mr. Newman George, members of the management of the HDC, members of staff, HDC, members of UDCOT, visitors all, members of the media. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon to be here with us to mark the opening of a construction project which indicates that the housing construction program for 2016-2018 is now well and truly underway. When I was invited to open this function this evening and to start this project, I thought that there might have been a mistake because I was trying to figure out how long ago I knew of this project. But I didn't want to go back as far as it really was because that would have passed my retirement age. But I seem to recall that it was a piece of land in here which was owned by a private owner who offered it to the HDC and the UDCOT. I'm not sure which one actually did the payment, but I'm sure whatever money was paid then, the HDC is smiling today because the value of this property certainly would have appreciated since it was acquired to now. But I thought, I left the housing program in 2007, November, and I assumed that this piece of land was consumed in the housing construction, especially when I saw the amount of billions that was spent in the intervening period. So when I was asked to come to a river on street, I said, it must be that they're expanding on on phase one. And then, of course, those who transported me here very carefully, I couldn't convince them to stay on the bus route and go north because I thought I knew where this place was. But we came through a longer route, but we ended up in the correct place. So thank you very much for getting me here. But the point that I should be making is that there are two things that control the housing program. One is the availability of land. And the other is this tremendous demand for houses in Trinidad and Tobago. The availability of land is a function of the small size of our country. There are many of us who have no idea how small our country is. But let me give you an idea how small our country is. I flew from Guyana a couple of days ago, and I flew over a farm, and it took longer to fly over that farm than it takes to fly across Trinidad. And then we flew over some islands in the Orinoco, and as you look down, you can see many, many islands in the estuary of the Orinoco, and all are bigger than Trinidad. But we are a small country, and the one thing that is not increasing or growing or becoming more available is land. But the demand for houses increases because as people want to improve their lives and the lives of their families, shelter, like food, is a requirement. And there was a time when the population housed itself by looking after its own needs, finding its own plots of land, and building whatever within the means of the family. But even so, it was determined that the rate at which the population without state help was building houses would have left us in a situation where we'd always be experiencing this chronic shortage. So for the last 50-odd years, housing construction in Trinidad and Tobago, state housing construction, has been an integral part of the economy of Trinidad and Tobago and the social development of the country. And I could rattle off a number of names of communities which would not have existed in the way they exist today had it not been for the state's involvement in this very vital project and requirement and responsibility. If we start in the Western Carenage, Diamond Vale, St. James, Inner City Port of Spain, Laventil, Barataria, all the way up to Toco, across to Tobago, Bonaccord, Charlottesville. You go to Central Trinidad and all the way to the deep south into Point 14, you will find housing communities, some of them small, some of them large. But a lot of the houses in this country were built by state involvement and state expense. But even so, today, the demand for housing still outstrips the supply, and the availability of land is even more and more challenging. Except for Central Trinidad, the availability of land is extremely challenging. In the West, say west of Port of Spain, a tremendous demand, but one could hardly find a spot to do a housing project. But the demand is there. In Port of Spain, we have no new land, but we do have some occupied lands which are underutilized, and in some instances we may have to revoke the Slum Clearance Act to remove what is there and to replace them with modern, better units which bring about better use of the land by going up and also by design of structures that are built. San Fernando, we do have some land around, and a lot of housing has taken place around San Fernando. Point 14, we do have some land. But here in Arima, this project represents an expansion of the urban area of Arima into what is probably one of the most salubrious of locations for a housing project. One could hardly leave here this evening and not envisage the perfect place to live. New houses with a river running through and the verdant hills surrounding with such an environment. What can Arima say? But Arima always gets the best. But there's another problem, and that is because of the state's very heavy involvement in housing construction, one gets the impression that the population now is over-reliant on the state to satisfy a need completely, which cannot be satisfied completely. And if that is so, then it means that very many people, in the face of successful housing projects across the country, very many people still remain frustrated, applying for many, many years and waiting for many, many years and not being able to get a unit. Because I'm told that there are about 100,000 applicants on the list at this point in time. And if that is true, or even if half of that is true, then the state's ability to deliver understanding that even as you're delivering, young people are growing up and getting married and wanting their own houses. Somebody who is 20 years old, 10 years later, 30 years old, and they're saying, I've applied 10 years ago. The question is, how much can the state undertake in this area of tremendous demand, with the demand expecting satisfaction purely from the state's output? So we have to find another way to add to the national effort. And we have to find a way of encouraging the private sector, either at the individual level or the corporate level, to get involved. Another consideration is that the most successful period of housing construction is normally identified with a period of significant government revenues. When government revenues were very restricted, as they were in the period 1986 to 1991, very few houses were built, simply because the state just did not have the money to pay contractors to build houses. And during that period, the population understood that, because there wasn't this demand for housing where everybody was saying, I want a house and I want it now. If my memory serves me right, during that period, 86 to 91, only a few hundred houses were built. But then the state's revenues increased considerably later on. And when I was housing minister, we were running an annual housing construction program of approximately $2 billion a year. And in terms of houses completed and houses started, we were in the order of about 21,000 units. And even so, what we found is that the more you built, the more the demand increased, because people were now seeing that houses were being built and made available, and they were looking to the state for their house. It has reached the point now where people are saying, I want a house, and my MP ain't giving me a house, just in the same tone and approach of I want a hops bread. And you have a bag of hops bread and I want one. Not really realizing that a house is really an expensive item. In the last administration, the average cost of an HDC house was over $1 million. This government has decided that that is unacceptable, unsustainable, and we will go back to the real cost by getting competition, and I'm told that these units that are going to be built here are going to be in the order of $530,000, $550,000. That is a kind of a reasonable price. But had we stayed in the 1.3 million, fewer houses would have been built, or the HDC would only have been able to service those persons who could have serviced a mortgage of that nature. But the greatest need exists among those persons who are least able to face the market. If you look at the papers and you see houses for sale, invariably the houses for sale in the newspapers are beyond the reach of the average income earner in this country. And therefore the housing program of the state has to be mindful of that and set about to build mostly houses for those persons who are least able to face the market. And those persons who are able to face the market should face the market where the private sector, or if once in a while the state does some mid-market or up-market units, then those persons would be able to face closer to market price. So you will see a shift in the HDC's position, where more effort would be put towards the lower middle income group, those persons who really need the help. We have experienced situations where we went in very expensive areas and built, knowing that we were building in expensive areas. But we did it knowing that there was a market for those units. And what the state was doing was using its role in encouraging construction to increase the national housing stock for all. So we're not saying that the HDC is confined to low affordability houses, and I'm deliberately not using the words low income, because low income houses really no longer exist. A basic 1,200 square feet unit, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that is not low income in the scheme of things, of the earnings of the country. Excuse me. What we do have is the state taking the responsibility to provide the infrastructure and absorbing some of the cost of that infrastructure, paying the contractor and absorbing some of the cost of the construction. That is where the lower middle income householder or the middle income householder gets an immediate benefit. Because when the house is rented or sold, it is not done at full market price. If it is sold with an element of subsidy. If it is rented below the real market price. So the state's housing program is built on the understanding that there is some element of subsidy so as to make the unit available and affordable. And that is why we have to be careful that units built by the state don't get into the wrong hands. When I was housing minister, we set about to build a number of housing units in the Four Roads area, aiming to build those units for ownership by middle-income homeowners, lower middle-income homeowners. There would have been some element of subsidy involved, but we had to ensure that the subsidy wasn't outrageous, that it was manageable within the scheme of things. In fact, there are points of views in the country that even those levels of subsidies were too high, and that the state really shouldn't be taking on this burden of providing these units at such tremendous cost to the wider taxpayers. And then there was a change in the administration, and the units were upgraded, because all of you know, every house, concrete and cement, it is largely how you finish it that gives you the final cost. And if you finish HDC units to the value of $3 and $4 million, then clearly you are building for people who have no right looking for a subsidy from the taxpayer. But unfortunately, that is what was done. And now, instead of those units being made available to the homeowners for whom they were designed, those units have been so completed and finished and now valued between $2 and $4 million that the Ministry of Housing is now forced to sell them on the open market. And that is a policy that has gone astray. You will not be seeing more of that. You will be seeing more effort in the area where a subsidy is reasonable and acceptable. And we will come up with arrangements that will encourage the private sector to join with the government, either on private sector land or in some areas where the land is state-owned. And we encourage the private sector on the basis that the private sector can do that building and make a profit. Because no private sector person is going to set about to build houses for you because you want a house. They will build for you because in so doing, they can make a profit on their effort and their enterprise. What we have to make sure is that the competition is such that the profit that they make would be reasonable, and that the houses that they would build for the HDC on the behalf of those who will have those houses are properly built and everybody wins in the end. The other problem is that, as I said earlier, the impetus in the housing program is increased when there's money available in the National Treasury. I need not tell you now that this is not a time when the Treasury is overflowing with money. This is a time when we are experiencing some significant shortages in our national revenues. And therefore, the government funding housing construction, even as we want to, would be restricted by the government's inability to find the amount of money to carry the program as we carried it a few years ago and to try to meet the needs, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of applicants. So what we have to do is to come up with ideas to allow the private sector to put private sector funding to work towards the same objective. And the HDC, along with this kind of project that is going on here today, where you will encourage some small and medium contractors to get involved, we also, in other sites, will invite the private sector to come in and finance and construct units for the national community, and the payment of those units will be done in such a way that it is affordable to those who will have the units, those who build the units, and those who will fund the units. So maybe sometime in not too distant future, we'll go on another site, and you will see a contractor who would be a financer, constructor of a project. And then that site might be a state-owned site where the contractor raises the finance and comes to the project, or it might be a private site where a person owns some land and is saying, look, this land is approved for housing. The housing could be lower middle income. We can build it, but the HDC database has persons on it who are prepared to pay a mortgage, and such persons would come and buy that house. So you marry the contractor or the owner's wish to the construction, to the funding, with the person who's willing to take the mortgage, and the HDC acts as a broker and a facilitator in the middle of that. And also, in some areas of this country, there are certain tracts of lands that are owned by the state, which are deemed to be suitable for housing. And the state may also, as is being done in the EMBD program now, make lots available, make a pool of funding available, and persons borrow that money and use their own family efficiencies to build the unit that they want to build. That last model is a model that worked very well in Tobago after Hurricane Flora. I don't know how many of you have been to Tobago, but one of the things that strikes you in Tobago is the quality of the housing in Tobago. Virtually every village in Tobago has a large number of very good quality houses. What you may not see is that very many of those houses were built by HDC loans to families after Hurricane Flora destroyed housing in Tobago. Families were able to go to that pool of money, borrow within their means, and build houses beyond their means. Because the industriousness of the family, and as they earn or they made themselves more indebted, or whatever they earned, instead of spending it on other things, they spent it on a family home. And that has given Tobago a very good housing stock across the island. And that model of families building with an initiation and help from a pool of funds is something that we look at. And the Minister of Finance would look at it to see where that pool of funds can be had and encourage families to borrow directly, low-income loans, and they normally start out building small units, but somehow the units mushroom into magnificent edifices. Today, I want to congratulate the HDC staff for getting to the point where you are reinitiating this housing program. Because this housing program is a major contributor to economic activity. When a house is built, it involves a number of skills. From those who work in the bank preparing the mortgage, those who work at the offices with the drawings, those who work at the various offices doing the approvals, those who work in the quarries to extract the gravel, the concrete, the hardware stores, those who provide the food on the site. All of these people get into economic activity once there's a housing program. And then even after that, there are certain skills that are employed continuously. Because one of the things you notice, no state housing project remains the same after it has been distributed. The owners immediately start to upgrade them. And the skilled workers are employed all the time. And then when you own a house, those of you who own a house, know that once you own a property, you are permanently involved in maintenance. And maintenance involves a variety of skills. the plumbers, the painters, the carpenters, the joiners, they're all there. So every housing unit, every housing area is an expansion of the national economy. So we spend a number of millions of dollars here. That money would be distributed very widely across a number of families. And of course, the mayor of Arima and the chairman of the Tunapuna Corporation will be fighting for who collects the taxes from here. Because as you know, we are about to bring about some significant improvement with respect to local government reform. And one of the things that will be a feature of the local government after the next election and the laws are passed to bring it about is that local government bodies will be required to collect and keep and use the taxes that accrue to the units within their borders. And that is what caused the mayor of Arima to be here this evening. He's trying to extend the boundary of Arima. He has his eyes on the taxes on these units. But the chairman of Tunapuna Corporation is smarter than that. He is here to make sure that the boundary doesn't change. Because they know, like Tobago, if you are running the corporation or the borough and you have that revenue stream, the very fact that you have a revenue stream, you can do a whole lot more than when you're waiting for some money to come quarterly and it doesn't come and you can't do anything until you see it. Once you have a revenue stream, you can do wonders in terms of planning and execution. So the mayor and the corporation, this afternoon, I think the corporation brought out more councillors than the mayor. So Mr. Mayor, I think things are looking too good. Eh? So all this thing about Kitchener and Holly Batodier and Ashton Ford and all that, Tunapuna Corporation is, but as the city grows, we expect that the boundary of Arima will grow with it. And the quality of life would be one that we can all be proud of. Because I tell you something, as a member of parliament, I have people coming to me, and when I go out to see my constituents, there's nothing more heartbreaking than to see a family living in squalor. And there's one thing that a house does. It offers the immediate opportunity for persons who have been living in conditions that are unacceptable to move into an environment where immediately they feel as though their lives have changed because they have a good roof over their head, they have a door they can lock, and young boys and young girls are secure close to their family. And of course, the community has its own character. And growing up in this area, we expect that some of our best children will grow up here because this is one of the best areas in Trinidad and Tobago. So HDC, I compliment you, and I look forward to coming back here when you begin to hand out the keys to the lucky persons to whom keys are allocated, because I know that HDC and homes change lives in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much, and we look forward to the exercise. Construct safely, get the best value for money, and do the job well. Thank you very much as we go forward into the future.